Welcome to the RTW podcast. I'm Josh Baldwin, Managing Director of Communications at RTW. And for this episode, I'm joined by my colleague Josh Kennedy Smith, Managing Director, Research Analyst at RTW. And we'll be speaking with Mark McKenna, Chairman and CEO of Prometheus Biosciences. In this conversation, we'll explore Mark's background and the story of Prometheus, its recent acquisition by Merck, and the relationship between a CEO and investor. Hope you enjoy the conversation. Welcome. Thank you, Mark, for being here. Appreciate it.
A pleasure. Glad to be here.
Josh, thank you for co-hosting with me generously. So we've got a bunch of things that I'd love to talk to you about. I think maybe we start out with your career, get a little bit of your background, and sort of understand how you came to be where you are.
Yeah, sure. Again, thanks for hosting. Josh, great to be with you again. So again, Mark McKenna, Chairman and CEO of Prometheus. I spent better part of 20 years in healthcare, and started with Johnson & Johnson in the device world, worked at Bausch & Lomb for over a decade. My last position there was running the U.S. franchise, and then had a unique opportunity to pivot over to pharma, where I ran a company called Salix Pharmaceuticals. And then if that wasn't enough transition and change from consumer health device to pharma, I got a phone call from a guy named Tachi Yamada, who passed away a few years ago, who was a friend and mentor. And he said, "Hey, I want you to take a look at this platform and this early technology out of Cedars-Sinai." And my first instinct was, well, I'm not a preclinical guy.
Yeah.
I'm running a $2 billion business, I had other aspirations. But the more and more work I did on this, the more and more conviction I had. And not only did I want to actually invest in this personally, but invest my time. And yes, we burned the boats and moved to
Wow.
San Diego for what was a pretty remarkable journey, but pretty humble beginnings that I'm sure we'll get into today.
Yeah. So what was that transition like? Talk a little bit about sort of going from the big pharma, big company, lots of resources, to a startup, essentially.
I think, if you were to ask a lot of people that I work with, I think that the hallmark of my career has been able to, learning agility and just, asking questions to better, understand, putting yourself out there. That's when you grow and learn the most. And, having had the experience going from consumer health to device to pharma, I had a really good backbone around how the business operates. There's some nuance to, pharma that's different than device, but, some of the business principles are the same. Preclinical is very technical. And I knew that if I was going to be talking to investors, I had to know it as well as my scientist. Mm-hmm. And so, job one is getting up to speed and understanding all the nuance that goes into the business, from, the assays that are needed to submit for your approval with the FDA to the clinical strategy. And even if you don't have every element of it covered, the right questions to ask to get to the most important aspects of it. So look, I think that this was an incredible opportunity that I just kind of felt that, a lot of patients could benefit from this technology. IBD is a heterogeneous disease, 5 million people globally. And unfortunately, a lot of patients are getting suboptimal care today. And we believed at Prometheus that this was the best hope for those patients. And so it was partly with that conviction of addressing that unmet need. And then secondly, the business opportunity of really creating substantial shareholder value. When I first got there in mid-2019, it was a $50 million company. That was the valuation. And there was a lot of other nuance to the business with regard to it had a diagnostic business, a commercial stage LDT commercial business. And then it had this, great technology on the therapeutic side with a novel target and data that would allow us to build out a portfolio of programs throughout, I&I. But the early days were pretty challenging. When I first got there, we thought there was about 18 months worth of capital. Turned out there's about 7 or 8. And I remember going into my CFO's office at the time and saying to her, what happens if we can't raise the funds?
Yeah.
It may seem like self-evident now, but in the moment it was like, okay, what are the options? And she was very matter of fact. She's like, well, we'll just file this, bankruptcy form.
Oh, wow.
We'll start laying people off. We'll shut it down. And I was like, wow. I was like, that is not a good option.
Let's talk option B.
Yeah. What does plan B look like? And look, there's a lot of amazing things to the science here. The business model needed some work. And one of the things that was a challenge is that we didn't have any like professional investors. It was a Cedars-Sinai spinout.
Right.
And so it took some time for folks to understand the opportunity, what is the right business model? Given that we had the diagnostic side and the therapeutic side, we get greater clarity as we advanced. And, Cedars-Sinai this is a unique bet for them. It obviously paid off in a big way, $1.3 billion, but, they had to double down. And, I remember driving up to Los Angeles and having dinner with their CFO and saying, look, here's what I think we can do. I'm more convinced of it than ever before, but, we need more time to be able to advance the science, advance the programs, and attract the right investors. Yeah. We had at the time term sheets from other investors. They just weren't attractive. And we were on the cusp of a couple different milestones that were forthcoming that would provide greater clarity to the business model as well as, de-risk the program a bit. And so that was the journey. And up until that point, it was, call it 24 people on the therapeutic side, all punching above their weight, rolling up sleeves and, believing in the greater good that we could create here. And then a few investors saw the opportunity of what we were building.
So can you talk a little bit about that? Because I'm curious about, so you're going from big pharma device, big companies where you were not involved, I imagine, in investor communications or raising money in any way, and getting in and that being a big part of the job, I would imagine. What was that like?
Yeah, I had pretty good visibility and exposure to the IR side. I ran the biggest business at Bausch Health at Salix. It was a $2 billion franchise. So I spoke at various debt conferences. I interacted with investors there, but it's a different phenotype than the biotech investor. And in terms of raising capital, no, this was the first time I had an opportunity to do that. And it was much more challenging than I thought, partly because of COVID, partly because of the fact that the business model wasn't ready. And it took the right investor to see the opportunity to really maximize this. And, with any novel science, there is inherent risk. It's very easy to make a bet on the fifth, MOA. The upside's not as high. Yeah. But I think that's where you got to combine, from on the other side of the table, the investor's got to have the right science and they have to have the right understanding of, what's going to take to make this commercially viable. And I think that's where I see a big difference in the market with a lot of investors is that some of them really are, methodical and really deep on the science, but they miss out on what could be. And then what limitations are you going to face as you go to try and get reimbursement? So putting the pieces of the puzzle together, I think is really important. You can't just do one. And the other thing I would say is that over and over again, what I've heard from investors is that the value that we place on the team has exponentially gone up based upon your story and other stories, based upon the fact that, great science only comes to light, with the right people executing against it. And so I think that you got to have confidence in the people that you're investing in. And so it's the science, it's the business model, and it's the team. Yeah.
So maybe this is a good opportunity to get Josh in here. Josh, can you talk a little bit about sort of the early days of how did this come across your plate, the opportunity with Prometheus, and what was that sort of exploration like? What were you looking for? What did you see?
Yeah, it's funny. I went back in my notes today and I looked up the date of our first meeting. It was May 12th, 2020. Wow. So it was in the dead of like that first kind of wave of COVID where everyone was still probably in shock. And so I just want to tell one anecdote, which is one that always sticks with me is at that point in time, we had a 6-month-old essentially, and we were fighting our way through this by ourselves, just two parents. I was pretty disheveled and I'd wake up, I just basically put on some pajamas and sit down and I would work at a laptop that was basically set up on a card table. And so I get this introduction. I'm like, okay, I'm going to meet with Prometheus, and you get a little bit of background on the story, but you don't really know what you're getting into. And along comes Mark onto the screen. I was like, wow, this dude is really put together. He looks great. And I'm sitting there, I'm embarrassed. I have a castaway beard and I haven't had a haircut in months. But no, in all seriousness, I think the first impressions of the company really they were able to tell a very kind of, or even not even tell, but like ask a provocative question, which is in IBD, like, how are we going to make a step change, some kind of quantum leap? And Mark, like in looking at my notes, that the story that they were telling is ultimately what was delivered, right? 3 years later. And so there's obviously a lot that happened in between there, but I think where we started was just basically saying, here's, some science that is interesting. The thesis that they have, which kind of became our thesis as well, was one, again, it was this question they were asking, like, how do we improve things way beyond where standard of care is? And so when you're interacting with teams and they're telling you that and they're just saying that, that's one thing. Mm-hmm. But there was like a roadmap that was kind of painted for us that says, here's a target where there is some clinical validation. And then behind that, there's all this genetic evidence. And so as Mark was kind of alluding to, there was multiple parts to the business. And so it became super interesting in that respect because it was something that looked and felt different at the time. It was something that you weren't used to seeing when you were approached by an immunology company or you were pitched an immunology company. It felt different. And that's the one thing that going from that time point in May until we closed the crossover later in the fall, where you were able to kind of hold on to that and work down that path of saying like I know that there's something special here and I just have to go and do the work now to unpack all of it so that we can get more confident and we can believe again in the story that they're telling and that they're going to be able to execute on it.
Yeah. So you mentioned we came in at the crossover round and we invested again at the IPO, and then there was a big phase 2 data readout late last year. All opportunities where we could have gotten out, we could have made a good deal of money and been out. Looking back, it's obvious why we did that. It was a great move, but at the time, there's probably that question that comes up, and I'm sure a lot of other investors would have maybe taken that guaranteed check and said goodbye.
Some did. And I think Mark can probably speak to this better than I can. Like, this story is not a perfect one, right? So it wasn't, even though if you like reflect on it, you look at like the stock chart, it almost looks like it's a straight line up. But there were points, even last year, where things got choppy, and that wasn't their fault. That was the market, and then it was Pfizer. There were so many people that were kind of paying attention to the Prometheus story, but to do that, you had to pay attention to the landscape. And right. We had this competitor that was out there talking about the program, and that benefited them immensely. But it also, probably the greatest pain that we all saw as investors was a moment in time, kind of in the early part of 2022, where people were just unsure if all of the commentary that was being made by the senior management at Pfizer was aligning with what some of the less senior people were saying. And there were points of time where it was a little scarier.
Yeah.
Yeah. Look, I think that every firm has their own risk tolerance. And I think that one of the biggest challenges, to this story is that, the stock was moving in the right direction, to your point. There was gains to be had. And depending on macro factors of the funds and the market, certain investors had to make certain decisions. I think that, Josh didn't stay with us blindly. It was a thoughtful decision with him and Rod and others in the team that said, look, they've outlined a playbook, they've executed against that playbook, and the science continues to deliver. And I think one of the hardest things in this space is finding companies like this that are novel, that have, opportunity to be 10 billion or more. There's just not a ton of them out there. And so, yes, you can go take, a 5x return on your investment pretty quickly following the IPO. But the other aspect is RTW was really helpful in help with the strategy, to the extent that you can do that as a public company. Have you thought about this or that? Have you seen what this other company is doing here? How are you thinking about setting expectations with investors? All these type of things. I mean, that's what you're looking for. There's plenty of capital out there. Yeah. What's different, though, that I saw with our relationship is, one, the early bet. Both RTW and Joy Gosh saw the opportunity together. We were able to build a really incredible syndicate that by and large, all stuck by us. We had incredible investors in that crossover. Cormorant, 0.72, Cowan, and Perceptive. But it took the courage of, RTW and one other investor to really say, hey, we're going to put pen to paper and we're going to put our necks out there and make a bet. And, that was a long process to get to that point. A lot of tire kicking, a lot of pressure testing the assumptions. So I think just to wrap up this section, I would just say that there were many opportunities, but you got to, this is about making the right bets, but they got to be informed. And, I think that having clear communication between management and investors in an appropriate way is what it takes to have people stick with the story throughout the journey.
Yeah. So you touched on it a little bit, but I'd love to dig a little bit deeper on the relationship between the relationship between investor and CEO. Once you got the deal signed and we've invested, what does that look like on a day-to-day basis? How does that
kick your feet up? Just hang out a bit.
Nice.
No, we did 85 red eyes in four years.
Wow.
And we, because there was education that needed to happen in order to broaden our investor syndicate, we were kind of felt like Avis, so we had to try harder. Yeah. And so we were, out in front. We probably did 300 different investor meetings last year.
Wow.
And that education, those investors also looked at who was the early supporters, who put their neck on the line, what work did they do? But also it was a process where, setting expectations and delivering on them and being reasonable. And one of the biggest things that we kind of put our neck on the line was around our phase 2 timelines. If you ask most investors, most were kind of banking on some type of delay because we put some aggressive timelines out there. But internally, we had confidence that we could deliver them. And it was important for our credibility with investors that we did. Yeah. And I think that we surprised a lot of people, not only with the data, but also with the level of execution.
What's that like, Josh, from your side, working with a CEO and management team, between rounds? And
yeah, I mean, to Mark's point, you don't kick your feet up. You continue to work and you continue to, pull on those loose threads, so to speak, to figure out what can continue to go right and what can not continue to go wrong, but what can go wrong, right? Yeah. And I think to Mark's point, one of the things that we were really impressed by was that as we continued to kind of dig in, that everything that we, encountered or would talk about, we could go back and we could find data that was supportive of everything. And so it helped over time. Again, you don't just build this confidence and then just say, okay, well, we invested, whatever it is, $50 million. So I hope one day that turns into this. You're actively digesting it constantly and thinking it through and reworking those things, checking the math. And so, I remember a lot of these early conversations, right? This is even before we, closed the crossover, just like, oh, I have to check this box now from the standpoint of they just said that they have all these backup plans for enrollment that are going to keep them on time. Is that real or is it BS? Mm-hmm. And we were able to, again, whether it's just talking to them, talking to KOLs, you put pen to paper and you start to work this stuff out. You do the math and you're like, oh, no, this all makes sense. This is real. And I believe them. And so it's being able to step through those things, again, incrementally, to build up the story, build up your confidence that as you're heading into these events that, again, we looked at it at first and it was like, well, Pfizer started this study way before you guys, is it even possible to catch up? And it's like, well, this is how we're going to catch up. We're going to do it this way. We're going to do it this way. We're going to do it this way. And then you go and you check all of that. And you're like, oh, well, sounds like they actually are. And they did.
One other thing I would add to this discussion is that there's over 1,000 public biotech companies. Just thinking about it from a company's perspective, and back to your question around what is the role of the dialogue between management and investors as a public company. And obviously you're going to be presenting at the conferences, but also you got to be out there and be visible and be sharing the story because you're competing for mind share. And there's plenty of places for people to put money. Why are they going to put it with you and your team? And so I think that was part of our strategies. One is we had the plumbing internally to execute. We had a great team that was punching well above their weight. And we're all coming largely from big pharma. People that had an entrepreneurial spirit that wanted to build their own company. So the plumbing was there to do that. And then we had a great team in IR, and that was an area that I absolutely love, is the interaction, the relationships that were built, being out there. And it wasn't always pretty. There was there were a lot of white knuckle moments. What is Pfizer going to say this morning? Yeah. It can have nothing to do with what we do. It has everything to do with what's happening in the broader market and with specific companies that are competitors that impact our stock. And we would game theory those things. But at the end of the day, our internal plan was, we knew we had the better mousetrap. Mm-hmm. We knew we could move faster, and we did.
Yeah. So one thing I wanted to ask you about, you just sort of touched on, is with any successful company, especially startups, there comes at least one sort of near-death, experience. When you think about that and Prometheus, what comes to mind? Was there like one big thing, or is it more a series of?
Yeah, I think that it was, this is a tale of two stories, the first 2 years and the second 2 years, right? The first 2 years was all about, early science, fundraising. Mm-hmm. The second part of the story was around, execution and M&A strategy. The second half of the story being much more fun than the first half. Look, there was a lot of white knuckle moments as we were thinking about, this whole question around solvency and like how much money do we have to actually execute against it. You got to prioritize in making various decisions. I'll tell you one story. Before we did the crossover, we did a deal with a European company on our second program. It was a collaboration. We gave up European rights on that second program. What most people don't know is that was life or death. That capital that we raised, not only did it sustain us for a number of quarters, but it actually was the validation that helped us get the crossover done. Wow. Even if it was, it wasn't a major multinational, it was still a third party that was an expert in the GI area that said, hey, this is really interesting what they're doing. But that was life or death. And that $20 million that we raised funded the entire second program. Initially it funded the entire company, but if you just take a step back, it funded the entire second program, which was part of the rationale why Merck was so excited about our company, is that it wasn't just a one-trick pony. It was a full portfolio of assets. And so that was one of like the near-death experiences that, played out well by being creative with how we out-license certain rights while preserving, all the value on our lead program.
Amazing. So speaking of the second half of the story, more exciting. So it sounds like with the Merck deal, there were a few other players involved. What sort of going through that process, what would you say are some of the things that you did and your team did to really maximize the size of the deal, the success of the deal?
So there were a number of factors that, led to the outcome that we got. Obviously great science is the key to everything. But behind that is, creating the right backdrop to maximize shareholder value. And I think this was a pretty good case study when you think about, where we started, 50 million to 11 billion. Well, that second half of the story was all about, one, execution, two, about the right strategy, where we were painting a vision that was much grander than, it wasn't about a single asset. It was about actually completely disrupting and transforming a entire category. Yeah. Now, did everyone get there day one? Did we have some skeptics? Absolutely. But how do you get to, an outsized return for investors on an M&A transaction? Well, it's having the capital to proceed on your own where you don't need them. So following our data, we raised $500 million.
Right.
That was our sign to the market that we don't need the strategics. We're ready to go if we need to. And I think some investors were questioning that because of, why are you diluting that much? You don't need that much capital. But it was a position of strength for us as we were having those negotiations. We also, started this is all in the public domain, so there's no nothing that's not public here. But I would just say that we started a partnership process in October of 22.
Okay.
With the idea of educating, and depending on the outcome of the data, we would know, hey, if that's an appropriate pathway. So as disclosed in our 14D9, we had 17 parties that were under CDA.
Yeah.
Getting educated. And when we got our data, I think we got the data on Thursday or Friday. On Saturday morning, I'm calling the CEOs of these companies and heads of BD and saying, hey, based upon the data, a partnership does not make sense. There's not an offer you can put on the table today that our investors would think would be a good idea and our board. Yeah. And so that was yet another, and by the way, we're going to raise $500 million. And so a lot of them appreciated the fact that we weren't going to force them to do diligence calls over the holidays, but also there's some that were pretty upset about it because they really wanted in earnest to do a partnership, as did we, depending on the circumstance and structure and economics. So following that, we, at JP Morgan, there was obviously a lot of discussions going on at that point that were, not public at the time, where, a lot of interest, people wanted to, they knew it was a competitive process. They knew that there was a lot of interest here. This was the largest unencumbered asset in biotech. And it was a process of, playing a little hard to get, being open to a conversation, but also being confident in our path forward. The last thing I would say is like having good advisors along the table. We were thinking through every detail along this, what was communicated and when. We had both Centerview and Goldman Sachs. Goldman Sachs led our equity financing. Centerview was, kind of running with the, M&A strategy. And I think that with those two banks at work and the relationships that, quite honestly, that we built over the last couple of years with these pharma partners, I think that those were very helpful in getting a deal done and having multiple bidders at the table because of the fact that, one, they were educated, two, they had a direct line to me. And, in closing here on this topic, a big part of our calculation obviously is value. That's our job to maximize shareholder value. But, and maybe this gets me in trouble, but like getting this drug in the right hands is really important. Going back to the whole reason why we actually came to Prometheus in the beginning, which is trying to transform lives of patients. And I'm confident that, Dean Lee and Rob Davis, Mike Klobuchar, that team over there is fully committed to maximizing, the value for patients here. And, it's actually bittersweet, being here because there's, as I look at other companies, there's just not many Prometheuses out there. And, this was truly really special. And I think that, part of it was the science, part of it is the amazing team that we had. And, it's tough handing the baton off to Merck, but I think it's absolutely the right thing to do as we think about, several $100 million of investment required to get through phase 3 and, all the other indications that can be explored here. And in light of IRA, you need to start these programs in parallel much earlier than you did before.
Yeah, well, an amazing deal. Congrats again on getting it done. With that in mind, how do you think about what's next for you?
Well, what's next for me is I'm taking 2 weeks in the Caribbean, so I'll leave tomorrow for that. And I started off, I think I told Josh I was going to take the balance of the year off. Yeah. And then my tune changed a bit, and it was like, okay, I'm going to take the summer off. And so now it's going to be July. I'm holding July. But look, this is one chapter is closed. There's other chapters of the book. And I think that there's still a heck of a lot of unmet need out there. And, in the fall, there'll be more to come with what's next. But, where my passion is, company building. It's, there's still a lot of unmet need out there. And I think that going forward, chapter 2 of the book would be a lot easier than chapter 1. Some of the challenges that we faced with the, really early science not being capitalized. I think that on the next project, obviously, we have the team, we have capital to deploy through our investors who are, committed to helping to support us. And I think there is also a lot of opportunity on the consolidation side. Thinking about different biotechs where there's synergy, as well as mid-stage commercial companies. So I'm excited to share what's next in the fall.
Yeah, well, we'll be anticipating an announcement. One of the things that we like to ask is for an example of sort of a paradigm shifting innovation in life sciences. Is there anything that comes to mind for you, Mark, and then I'll ask Josh as well, like that you've seen that's a favorite of yours?
That's 2.0.
All right.
So maybe just talking more generally, I think the biggest thematic change over the last decade has been the fact that today, as I mentioned earlier, there's over 1,000 public biotech companies. If you look back 20 years, there's probably a handful of companies working on earlier stage science. Probably 70% of those are working in oncology, and that's going to change over time as immunology and cardiovascular disease become bigger. But let's just say half of them are working in oncology. I think that we're going to see in our lifetime a major shift in cures and finding therapies for these chronic diseases in a way that we haven't seen before. This is going to be the healthcare revolution in the same way that we saw the Industrial Revolution of the 1900s. And I think that this level of innovation that's happening in biotech companies today, is going to do what big pharma can't do. The risks they're not willing to take. That is the role of the biotech ecosystem, is to be able to take these ideas and move them faster, take different levels of risk than what a big pharma company would do, and remove the bureaucracy. So I think the biggest paradigm shift is going to be just the market backdrop and how many companies are working on new therapies and new targets that are going to change the lives of a lot of patients. That wasn't happening 20 years ago to the same extent as it is happening today. So, I think for me, there's just so much opportunity here. There's plenty of Me Too and Me Better programs out there. The role of biotech is to advance new science. And I think that it's important that, the system, the U.S., reimbursement system remain open to that. And they're not, squashing innovation, but rather, encouraging it. If you want to solve the cancer moonshot, what I'd be doing is funding as many of these, early stage ideas as you possibly can, knowing that one of these ideas could, be the key to unlocking, cures in melanoma and, gastric cancer and other areas.
Yeah. Before I go to Josh, I want to double click on that just a little bit. And you mentioned the IRA as sort of changing the way you look at drug development. What other things from a policy perspective do you think about that would be priorities or things to change to really power innovation, push innovation forward, and encourage it?
So I think that there's a couple things that I'd point out, and I don't want to go too far down the path there. That's going to get myself in trouble. But look, the healthcare system is in the U.S. is broken.
Yeah.
How's it broken? Well, you have an insurance system that you have a lot of middlemen in the process, and that are extracting value, but not necessarily adding to it from my perspective. And, you got to remove the incentives where, they're encouraging higher prices because they benefit from that. What a lot of people outside of our industry don't understand is that most of these drugs, they set a whack price and they pay a 50 to 60% rebate. Below that, the net price back to the pharma company after R&D cost and manufacturing cost is kind of value-based. And of course, there are the bad actors and outliers out there. But in general, we need to reward innovation, not penalize it. And so I think that fundamentally that needs to, be reflected in our policies. And, we need to think about how we fund earlier innovation. And I think that you're seeing a lot of these ideas coming out of academia. And we're starting to see a better bridge between the investment world and academia, so that science is actually, moving into companies, and to the extent that it wasn't happening before. But I think that on the just regulatory side, IRA is a challenge, and it is forcing companies to make different decisions about their portfolio. And it goes beyond just the surface level stuff of like small molecule versus biologic. There's significant downstream impacts that people haven't fully processed yet because some of that are still unknown. But the fact of the matter is that you're going to see people working on treatment for younger patients. You're going to see them working on biologics. You're going to see them stacking indications earlier. And you're going to see pharma make some different decisions with regards to M&A because of it. I don't believe this is going to change. I think that we need to learn to operate within the system. And, I think we need pharma and other advocacy groups to help make sure that, our government officials understand, there's no cancer moonshot if there's no biotech. The last thing I would say is that, the FTC has taken a very hard line on consolidation in this space. And here is another area where it's, in my opinion, very different than tech. Our ecosystem, requires there to be substantial M&A. In the absence of M&A, no one's funding these higher risk projects. And so I think that, you got to bifurcate the different sectors and understand the dynamic that's going on here, that we need consolidation here, and it should be encouraged because, a lot of these phase 3 programs cost $1 billion. It's almost impossible for a lot of these companies to raise enough money to do that. So what happens? Well, those drugs take much longer to get to market and don't never realize their potential for patients. And so I think that, addressing those issues would go a long way in terms of making a better experience for patients and for, the biotech ecosystem.
Yeah, that's great. All right, Josh, your favorite paradigm shifting innovation in life sciences?
I mean, I think the thing that we like to talk about here at RTW the most, right, is really just this explosion of new, therapeutic modalities. So I wouldn't necessarily talk about anything specific as much as I can point my finger to, like, in the time that I've been here, right? So like 7+ almost 8 years, I guess. We've seen, approvals for cell therapies, for gene therapies. We have protein degraders in the clinic now. We have gene editing in the clinic now, right? And so the way that I like to think about this and talk about it really is you have to pay attention to all of this stuff, but it's in those increments, right? Of like being here and now, just seeing it and being ready to kind of pounce. That's actually what I'm most excited about. So I don't know if I'm actually calling out anything that's like a paradigm shift as much as like, if you do the work to understand cell therapy, then maybe you're there and you're ready when it becomes, prime time to use it in immunology, for instance, right? So that's something that is coming, right? And so then similarly, you can look at a story like Prometheus and you can say, oh, it was really easy for us to get involved because having a companion diagnostic wasn't this like foreign crazy thing. It was like, what are these crazy people doing talking about how they're going to increase the, the remission rate in this super hard disease with a genetic, biomarker and a tool? Like, that's crazy. That's not crazy at all, because we'd seen that in oncology and we knew, right, the potential, right, of being able to use it. And so in many respects, it's really just being able to kind of key in on those things that actually are tangible from the standpoint of them, again, having the potential for that paradigm shift. That's the thing that gets me most excited, is that you're actually closest to it and you can actually almost reach out and touch it. You just have to know when to then kind of transact. And so it's, it actually serves as a perfect example, right, to talk about Prometheus and use it, right, as the thing that actually is super exciting, right? We didn't even get to talk about, and we're, that's the one thing I'm sad about, as Mark kind of alluded to, is we're not going to get to see, the third and the fourth and the fifth inning of Prometheus, because it's going to be kind of almost behind this curtain of Merck now. That's all fine and good from our standpoint as investors, I guess, in some respects. But as a scientist, it's actually disappointing, because we actually, like, one of the key catalysts that was going to be coming up for them was actually the diagnostic, cohort readout. We were expecting that this quarter, right? And so as to whether or not that we ever get to actually see that, we don't know. But then it was going to be the second program, and then they were going to, they were going to unveil the third program right at the end of the year. And so these are all these things that we kind of then, as I was saying, like, as scientists, we lose out on that.
Yeah.
So there's a tough balance there. I think we're pretty happy with the result. All in all, when all is said and done.
That's a very interesting take, though. And it shows that at heart you are a scientist, and it's, this is what gets people here excited about these things, is not necessarily just, how much did we make on this deal, but watching the science progress and getting to be a part of each of those sort of steps or innings for a company.
Yeah, it would be amazing to be here for another decade and see companion diagnostics come of age, right, in immunology. And that, again, I think about some of the early slide decks that I saw, right, that Mark and the team presented. And it was like this big group of like people that were all different colors. And it was like, here's subset of IBD1 and subset 2 and 3 and 4 and 5 and 8 and 10. And we're going to be able to interrogate all of this and go after it and get it from this disease where you're only, again, putting 10, 15% of patients into remission, and getting that up to something that we're used to seeing in a lot of these diseases, where you can actually treat, like in psoriasis, you can treat all these people super well, right? And so, again, like, it's going to be in increments and in steps, but we'll get there. And it's just like, again, I'm in a very fortunate position to be in the seat and get to see this stuff and interact with people like Mark, right, on a daily basis. And then, in these instances where we're fortunate enough to be able to finance these companies and work with them, right, like over these periods of time, it's fantastic. And it's like, again, reflecting on the last 3 years, in some respects, it feels like ages. And then in other ways, it just feels like literally like this blink in time. Yeah. So,
the only other theme I would talk through is about, which was really consequential in the Prometheus story, which is the role of data and AI and helping to unlock new opportunities for science. We were Cedars-Sinai spin out. And Cedars-Sinai over the last 2 decades have built this amazing data set, 20,000 patients, 200,000 samples. And only through that data set can you start to really find new and unique targets like TL1A, and then be able to develop diagnostics to identify the subset of patients. But this is happening all over medicine. And data, along with the ability to interrogate it using AI in new ways, is going to also play a big role in reshaping care for patients. And so I know that there's a lot of investors that are raising funds around AI, and I'm sure it's a decent portion of your portfolio here at RTW. But I think that that is going to be critical in terms of like solving the moonshots on cancer and other areas.
How do you think about that, Josh, and sort of the impact of AI on drug development or discovery?
Yeah, I mean, given my background and experience, and obviously having spent time at Schrödinger, which can be classified right as a AI company, there's a spectrum with which you can do it. And I think on one hand, this goes back to kind of one of the points that Mark was making, right? That at the end of the day, you can wield a sword or a tool or whatever it is, right? But it really is the people that kind of sit behind that instrument that ultimately are going to be the ones that can make sense of, make the inference, if you will, right, to wield that technology appropriately. And so Schrödinger is an example, right? It's very much, they built this, purposely built a platform that enables medicinal chemists to work more efficiently. And so that was one of the reasons why I was like, oh yeah, it's a no-brainer. I want to go work there. Like, they're doing cool stuff that helps me do my job better and more efficiently. That's smart. You can then stretch that further and you can say, oh, well, we're going to interrogate and solve biology just by clicking buttons, right? That's like the tech attitude towards biotech, which I think is I don't want to say it's purely and ultimate, like 100% fundamentally flawed. But if you think about, data and having to truly kind of make these connections, sometimes it's not always easy, and it's not always true that a computer is just going to be able to like see that, right? So there's a balance in there. But I am a true believer in, experienced management teams that know how to execute. And right, like a computer is not going to be able to tell you like what the metrics are for, IBD trials, and how many patients are going to be able to enroll at the site if XYZ goes wrong or COVID happens. Like maybe they can, I don't know. But
maybe a little ways off from that.
Like it serves to represent like, kind of the experience we had here. So, again, maybe going back to the earlier points I made, like it's always nice to be sitting next to that and know that it's out there and following it. I think for certain things, it's completely relevant and, applicable. Schrödinger's been around for almost 3 decades plus. They know what they're doing. These other companies are younger and they're maybe over-promising and under-delivering. And so you never want to say no to a piece of technology. So I think you just have to pay attention to it and see, right, what the true application of it is in that moment. And then over time, it grows.
Yeah. All right. Well, we're running up on the end of our time here. Mark, I really appreciate you being here. This was great. Good to hear more from you and learn a bit more about your career and Prometheus. And we'll look forward to seeing what comes next for you.
Yeah, no, I appreciate the opportunity and all the support, Josh and the team here at RTW. I can honestly say that without great investors, this outcome for patients would not have happened.
Awesome.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Cool.